Every breakthrough in aviation has been written with lessons learned from tragedy. In the early morning haze of May 25, 1979, a gleaming silver McDonnell Douglas DC-10 rolled toward runway 32R at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. It belonged to American Airlines Flight 191, bound for Los Angeles. In the cabin, more than 200 passengers settled in for what should have been a routine journey across the country. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the hum of engines as the aircraft taxied, shimmering in the sunlight. At 3:02 p.m., clearance crackled through the radio. Throttles advanced, engines roared, and the heavy tri-jet accelerated down the concrete strip. In seconds, the plane lifted its nose toward the sky, the city skyline shrinking behind it. Then, witnesses along the runway saw something they would never forget. The left engine separated from the wing, flipping over the top and tearing away hydraulic and electrical lines. For a moment, the airplane climbed gracefully, as if nothing had happened. Then it rolled left, inverted, and plunged beyond the runway's end. A fireball rose into the air. In a heartbeat, 273 lives were gone, the deadliest air disaster in U.S. history. The shock was immediate. For years, the DC-10 had been a symbol of modern engineering, powerful, efficient, capable of crossing oceans. But that afternoon shattered confidence not only in one airplane, but in the entire system that had created it. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived at a field of wreckage and smoke. The left engine lay hundreds of feet from the main impact site. At first, no one understood how such a thing could happen without any explosion or mid-air collision. As data and photographs poured in, a pattern began to form. Mechanics discovered that the pylon attaching the engine to the wing had broken cleanly at its fittings. Maintenance records from American Airlines showed that the engine and pylon assembly had recently been removed for inspection, not by the manufacturer's recommended method, but by a shortcut that saved man-hours. Instead of detaching the engine from the pylon, the entire unit had been lifted by a forklift, an improvised procedure that slightly twisted the metal fittings. Under stress, microscopic cracks formed, invisible to the naked eye. During takeoff, the immense vibration and thrust forces exploited that weakness. The pylon snapped. The NTSB's final report did more than assign blame. It uncovered how economics, training, and communication had all played silent roles. The maintenance crew had not been reckless. They were following a method that had seemed efficient and harmless, yet no system had caught the deviation. The Federal Aviation Administration had approved airline manuals without fully testing the consequences of alternate maintenance practices. McDonnell Douglas had not anticipated that operators might use forklifts rather than overhead cranes. The chain of assumptions linked factory floors to flight decks, and the weakest link had failed. In the weeks after the crash, the DC-10 fleet was grounded worldwide. Airports that once echoed with its deep three-engine rumble now stood silent. Passengers looked nervously at tail logos. Airlines scrambled to reassure them. Engineers worked around the clock to inspect pylons and redesign attachments. When the aircraft finally returned to service, it did so with new bolts, new inspection intervals, and new oversight from regulators who had learned that safety depended on more than design. It depended on discipline. But the legacy of Flight 191 went far beyond the DC-10. The accident forced a cultural transformation inside aviation itself. Airlines began to rethink maintenance procedures from the ground up. Quality control became a science rather than a checklist. Inspectors were given independent authority to halt unsafe practices, no matter the cost or schedule pressure. The FAA tightened rules on how airlines documented every task performed on an airplane. Manufacturers created dedicated engineering liaison teams to evaluate field modifications before they were implemented. Pilots, too, saw changes. The loss of an engine had once been considered survivable, yet Flight 191 showed how secondary systems, hydraulics, wiring, flight instruments, could be severed in ways that no simulator had ever replicated. Training programs were rewritten to include complex system failures, not just engine shutdowns. Crew resource management, still in its infancy, gained momentum as airlines realized that communication and quick reasoning in the cockpit could make the difference between control and chaos. The lessons extended beyond one accident. When later disasters struck, United 232 in Sioux City, Alaska, 261 off the California coast, investigators and pilots approached them with procedures shaped by the ghost of Chicago. Each new crisis carried traces of what had been learned that day. Verify maintenance practices. Never assume redundancy will save you. Respect the chain of design and oversight that binds every rivet to human lives. For the families who lost loved ones on Flight 191, reforms could never replace what was taken. Yet their voices during hearings and interviews kept the pressure alive. They demanded transparency, not compensation. Out of grief came policy, and out of policy came safety. Modern aviation's enviable record, tens of millions of flights without fatal accidents in many years, rests partly on the ground cleared by that tragedy. Even decades later, investigators visiting archives still describe the DC-10's engine pylon as a turning point. It changed how the world saw the relationship between cost and caution. Airlines stopped viewing maintenance shortcuts as clever. They saw them as threats. Governments realized that oversight must be constant, not occasional, and manufacturers began building systems designed to warn of structural fatigue before failure could occur. Today, when a jetliner lifts into the sky, hundreds of sensors feed data back to engineers in real time. Every vibration, every temperature shift, every ounce of fuel flow is logged. The philosophy behind that monitoring was born in the wreckage of Flight 191. The airplane that fell from the sky in 1979 forced aviation to evolve from reactive to predictive. It taught an entire industry that true safety is not the absence of accidents. It is the presence of vigilance. In the shimmering heat on that May afternoon, few could have imagined that the scene at O'Hare would echo for generations. But in boardrooms, classrooms, and hangars, the conversation still continues. Every new mechanic who learns how to torque a bolt, every engineer who signs off a design change, carries forward the memory of what went wrong. The chain that failed once has been reforged, link by link, through discipline and respect. When historians look back on the age of jet travel, they often mark 1979 as the year aviation grew up. Technology had already conquered distance. Now it had to master humility. Flight 191 reminded the world that machines, no matter how advanced, are built by human hands, and those hands must never forget the weight of their work. In the decades that followed, the DC-10 regained its reputation, serving faithfully for millions of flight hours. The redesign of its systems laid the groundwork for later wide-body aircraft. The MD-11, the Boeing 777. At memorials near the Chicago crash site, a ring of trees marks the outline of the field where the jet fell. Families gather quietly each year, reading names engraved on stone, the wind carrying the sound of aircraft overhead. To the untrained ear, they are just departures and arrivals. To those who know the story, they are proof of progress, proof that the world listened. Every pilot who taxis toward takeoff feels the invisible presence of those who came before. The checklists they recite, the torque limits they verify, the emergency drills they practice are not routine. They are remembrance. Behind each rule is a line in the sky traced by someone who did not return. The crash that changed aviation forever did not end in that field. It lives on in every safe landing that follows. From the silence after the explosion rose a new understanding. Safety is not static, and memory is the fuel that drives improvement. The legacy of Flight 191 is written not only in reports and regulations, but in the confidence of passengers who board airplanes every day without fear. They trust a system shaped by hard-earned truth, one that was rebuilt from fire and failure into the safest form of travel ever created by humankind. That is how a single afternoon of loss transformed an entire industry. It began with smoke above Chicago and ended with a promise that such a chain of errors would never be allowed to form again. The sky remembers, and so does every person who works beneath it. Each time a jet's wheels leave the ground, the echoes of that promise rise with it. The vow that their sacrifice would ensure that millions would fly safely into the future.